Good morning. Now we enter to Matthew Arnold. This is the last writer or poet we have to study as on criticism. The Matthew Arnold, you know that you might have studied some beautiful poems, and maybe late Victorian stage he became the greatest writer. His lifespan began in 1822 to 1888 and was reclaimed as a professional writer. And he brought, in addition to so many poems, he brought a critical study on poetry, what is called study of poetry. From this book, Study of Poetry, we find certain concepts of Arnold on poetry, what has happened in the Romantic revival time, and what is his idea of poetry, what all the things that to be included in the poetry. All these are being elaboratively described in this book. Before entering to his concepts, we try to speculate certain things on his personal life. You know, he was born in 1822 in a village what is called Hebron, and his father is Thomas Arnold, and his probably it is remarked that he is the eldest of 9 children of Mr. Thomas. He was the eldest, the captain of the children. And he is founder of modern England. People write, even Thomas, his own father, was an educationist and started a public school in London. And a highly intellectual man. Probably that may be the reason Arnold also became very intelligent and intellectual. So being an intelligent boy, he was admitted in the school and won lot of scholarships. And people see he is a real product of Oxford. His love for Oxford poems during the time of college studies, he was in the Oxford University, and he wrote 2 important poems during his studentship time. Line means Tiresias and Scholar Gypsy, a great poem. Scholar Gypsy you might have studied, very important poem. So in 1851 he was admitted in the government service and started his career as a school inspector. It is written in his biography. He did for all the primary schools what his father did for the publishing, almost all schools. He was going and inspecting. He pointed out the significance of Christianity is lost. Matthew Arnold, in his writings, he finds, or we can easily find, he is now telling the significance of Christianity, particularly in London and around the city. The Anglican Church took prominence. Catholic Church, the significance of Christianity as such was being lost during his time. And probably Matthew Arnold was totally pessimistic in this way. After his pension, he went to America. He did not want to continue living in London, so he went to America. There followed a series of lecture classes. Used to go to so many universities. Even the people who intellectually stand together, he goes and talk. He was living. And later after became an acclaimed writer in 1886. He died and it was seen that he died in a railway station. probably out of heart attack. So his body was found in railway station. Always wanted people to be good. So he was a man, even through his poems and writings, even the study of poetry as a critical study, he would advocate that people should love each other, or we want to do something good for the people. And basically, fundamentally speaking, Arnold was a very, very, very good man and a poet. To be a good man is very difficult. So Arnold is written everywhere. Arnold is considered everywhere. He is found to be very important person and significant person because of his attitude to humanity, attitude to human beings, and he was ready to consider all people equal. Even the scholar Gypsy, we get plenty evidences that how he loved humanity, how he was with the poor, how he was with the downtrodden. So this attitude toward, because this type of attitude can be accelerated only by the man who has compassion towards the people. Those people do not have compassion, may not be acting like that. So Arnold is not only considered to be a poet, but also a humanitarian. So his writing related to the importance of classism. All right, during his time or previously, so many classics writers were there, and how these classicism was being developed by the writers in the previous century or previous people. All right, Age of Reason, and before that classicism was there. So all these classical types of writing, how to be approached, Arnold almost illustrates in the detail in his book Study of Poetry. So he wrote some poems before turning to criticism. Actually, once he wants to write his study of literature, study of poetry, or before that, fundamentally he was a poet, and he had been writing all the poems with his intellectual attitude. And criticism of man, later he wanted to criticize. Then he became a critic, prefaced the poems, all the poems, prefaces he wrote in 1853. He followed John Dryden in everything. It is written by one of the critics on Arnold. Arnold was the staunch believer or staunch follower of John Dryden. All right, the person who lived in Age of Reason. His famous poems, MacFlecknoe, and so many dramatic poesy, lot of writings are related to how criticism should be done. All these kept by John Dryden. So he followed John Dryden everything, developed critical powers. He was a lecturer and proved his ideas. He wrote many journals. During his time, he was writing so many journals and articles and was much acclaimed writer during the time. He published essays in criticism. That is very important that you keep in mind and underline. Essays in Criticism was a publication or the matter that he published which revolutionized in the way of criticism, how a critic should behave, how a critic should criticize others. It is not a critic duty to kill a writer, but to develop a writer. Critic should not, Arnold says, critic should not murder a writer. He should give the pace and the paths to make the writer grow and walk in together. So that was his idea. Classicism, a group of poets known as spasmodics. During this time, all the classics poems, those who are interested in classicism, made together, stood together to become spasmodics. They are technically known as spasmodics. P.J. Barley, Alexander Smith, Sidney Bobel, all these poets were there during the time of Arnold. They sometimes sit together, think together, talk together, then plan to write together. So these spasmodic poets were very important. Poetry is expression of state of one's own mind. Every critic, all critics have given their own definition on poetry, like Wordsworth, like Coleridge, like T.S. Eliot, like P.B. Shelley. So many critics and poets have given their own way of definition on poetry. Our Arnold says, you write down, poetry is expression of states of one's mind. It is based on the one's mind. That is his idiom. So all these ideas to be kept that in mind. It is the state of mind of a person. If our mind is out of state, we cannot deliberately bring out our ideas out into the fact. But the person who writes, the same moment we understand his state of mind is very high. They believed ancient subjects were high quality. Yes, like once you depend on a peak, once you depend on so many odes and other things, all right, all these considered to be very highly intellectual. So during the classics time, all the poems and the writings were based on high quality and which could not be easily understood. That may be the reason our romantic revival poets told we want to communicate in the common man's language. But Arnold says, poem is not to be meant for common people. It should be kept for intellectual people. Modern poets should like modern subjects. All right, Matthew Arnold emphatically telling modern people should have modern subjects. Science and industrial revolution made a havoc during the time of 20th century. Plenty revolutions, industrial revolutions, agricultural revolutions, all developed, and everywhere we find growth of modernism. So the poet's subject matter should be the creed for the people who think and brood over something. The business of the poets is to give pleasure. Our Arnold as a poet says, poet's duty is to give pleasure to others. If no pleasure is maintained, what is the use of reading and enjoying a poetry? So pleasure-seeking activity is enjoying poetry. If poetry is not maintained there, then why should we worry about? So you that keep in mind, according to Arnold, the business of the poets is to give pleasure. Poetry aims higher. It is cathartic in nature. That we have studied catharticism in all the epic tragedies. Aristotle brings out this catharticism, what we find our purification of our mind and soul. Once we get, I referred earlier, the cinema that you find in the theater, watch in the theater, go out of the theater without tears, difficult. What is that one? Agasha Dudu, a cinema Malayalamu, earlier I mentioned in one of the critical studies. So that moment our soul and mind will be purified. Some people have no other way but to shed our tears, because we not only enjoy but understand the realism, what is happening in the real life of the heroine or hero in the will. So the science and industrial revolution, the poetry aims at higher quality, cathartic, some mixture of principle pages. There is no poetry. A great poetry gives joy. Earlier he told the poet's duty is to give you pleasure. Now he says a great poetry gives joy, even if it is written in a painful way. Look here. Even though a poem is written in a painful way, it should give joy to others. Look, this is the fact what Arnold says in his study of poetry. So, if the poet is also very pathetic in condition, if the poet is very sad indeed, if he writes something, its objective should be giving joy to others. Its real motto is to provide joy and pleasure. So pleasure is the real motto, or the joy is the real motto of the poem. A great poetry gives, even though it treats action rather than thought, and a social then concept of culture and life. When he brings out a concept of culture, how culture to be developed, how life, the philosophy of life to be found. Social doctrine is in culture and anarchy. We find in modern century everywhere anarchy or disillusionment or disintegration of thoughts, or wherever we find there is a dejection, and this to be overcome by reading and enjoying a poem. Poetry is not apart from life. Arnold says poetry is not to be separated from life. Life, the poetry is a real part of life. All right, not for art's sake. People say whatever written in the art, that is art for art's sake. Never say. Art is real, the feeling of life, or it is a part of life. Without art, without thinking, without enjoying the poetry, without enjoying the literature, life is spoiled. Our life is spoiled. It is a series of preoccupation of the art of living itself. We want to preoccupy the real living of art. All right. So again, what is to say more? Arnold is of the opinion that Arnold says the poetry or literature meant for pleasure. It is meant for joy. If your ultimate thinking is to get enjoyment or joy from piece of writing, it ceases to be a writing, it ceases to be a poem, it is not at all a poem, it is not at all a literature. So, more shape than substance, more style than matter. Poetic truth and poetic beauty is maintained. Truth is beauty and beauty is truth, we have studied in order to grace earned by John Keats. In the same way, whatever we find is beauty and beauty is truth. If truth is not there, beauty is not there. And what is beauty? Again problem coming. Beauty is the beauty that an object or that a person which attracts you the best way. If an object attracts you, that means that object is beautiful. If a person attracts you most from all other persons, that person is beautiful. Just like that, we cannot consider the beauty of and a frog is not the beauty of the frog. Frog has its own beauty, whereas on the other hand, a monkey has a monkey's beauty. All right, human being has human being's beauty. So frog can be identified from lot of species only because frog has its own feature and its own what is called beauty. So many species of frogs available. Some frogs are beautiful because its beauty is different from all other frogs. Like that, it is there. Truth is beauty and truth should be applied. Then automatically the object and the poem will be beautiful. Poet has to add something of his own to indicate what he thinks of it. After writing, just like in the piece of writing, we send messages of moral truth at the end. Wherever in the old stories we find what is the moral of the story. Moral of the story is like that. In the way, after reading, enjoying, after understanding a poem, the reader should get a moral value or moral truth at the end. This is to be applied by the poet. Alright, it is duty of the poet, Arnold says, to apply a moral instinct into the poem. This edition make life and poetry different. Poet's criticism of life is having contribution. A voice from his innermost soul should come. Arnold says, a poet, when he writes a poem, he should have a voice of his innermost soul. Poem should be a thing of beauty, joy forever. It should make life richer. A poem should make, after reading, what is the objective of understanding or realizing or reading a poem? Only for pleasure or joy. Then, in addition to that, after that you should make the reader's life richer. Look here. The reader should be the poem should make the reader richer in life. Alright, it should teach how to live. It not only the mission over, but poem or poet should make the reader to understand, to lead a life, how to lead a good life in future. It has a power of, alright, you had power of forms, then sustaining, then delighting. It has a power of, the poem has a power of formulating things, sustaining things, then delighting. It should have a moral shouting, truth, goodness, and beauty. Arnold is of the opinion that poem, if it is written with the power of the poet, should lead, should make a reader to lead a good life in what he should find sustaining, and it should have a delighting, and also it should lead him to the truthful life, and so that enjoy this world, enjoy this nature, and later he has to surrender until the eternal world. So what is called poet's concept of culture and life is the first area of our talk. Now that you read Arnold's area that kept in the textbook, then make a brief note on that, and slowly we will enter to other fields of our Arnold study of poetry in future. Till that moment, goodbye.